Hey everyone, welcome to UBG Bytes. I'm Alex.
And I'm Jamie. Today we're chatting about something pretty wild in the iOS world, the Palera1 jailbreak.
Oh man, this one's a good one. Palera1n has been making huge waves because it works on iPhones all the way from iOS 15 up to the latest iOS 18.3.2. It emerged in fall 2022 as what's called a semi-tethered jailbreak, which means your phone will boot normally after a restart, but you need a computer to re-enable the jailbreak. What's impressive is that the team behind it has kept it viable through multiple iOS updates. It started as a bash script implementation, but they've since completely rewritten it in C to optimize performance and reliability.
Wait, that's crazy. Apple is usually super quick about patching these things, right? How is it still working on the newest iOS?
That's what makes this one special. It uses something called the check M8 exploit, spelled with a mate at the end, but pronounced checkmate like in chess. The entire foundation of this jailbreak is built on this exploit discovered by security researcher Axie0MX back in 2019. It was so significant it got assigned an official CVE tracking number. Year 2019, number 8900. What makes it unprecedented is that it targets the boot ROM, which Apple internally calls secure ROM. Think of the boot ROM as the absolute first code that executes when your device powers on. It's literally embedded in read-only memory at the factory. And that's the key point. Being in ROM means once the chip is manufactured, that code is physically baked in. No software update in the world can change it. So if there's a vulnerability there, it's permanent for the lifetime of the device. This is what security researchers call a hardware level or silicon level vulnerability.
So it's like permanently vulnerable?
Exactly, but only on specific devices. iPhones with A8 through A11 chips. We're talking iPhone 6s through iPhone 10, plus the corresponding iPads. Anything with an A12 or newer is safe from this particular exploit chain.
Got it. So what's the story behind Palera1n? When did it come out?
It first dropped in fall 2022. Started as a bash script, but they've since rewritten it in C to make it faster and more reliable. The whole thing is open source on GitHub. The team maintains an active organization where you can see all the components. They're very transparent about their work, which is fantastic for security researchers who want to learn from it.
Open source, nice. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does this checkmate thing actually work?
Okay, so Checkmate was discovered by a researcher called Axiom X back in 2019. The vulnerability specifically targets weaknesses in how the USB device firmware upgrade protocol is implemented in the boot ROM. When an iPhone enters DFU mode, it sets up a USB stack to handle incoming firmware data. The vulnerability occurs during this initialization process. Let me break down the technical execution in stages. First, there's a memory leak stage. The exploit begins by stalling USB endpoints and sending multiple specially crafted requests. When specific conditions are met, these zero-length packet requests accumulate on the heap. That's the dynamically allocated memory region. If you trigger a DFU shutdown at just the right moment, these packets remain allocated in memory, creating what's called a dangling pointer situation. Second, there's the heap manipulation phase. This is where things get really clever. The exploit uses advanced memory manipulation techniques, what security researchers call heap feng shui or heap grooming, to carefully arrange memory objects. The goal is to ensure that when the device performs the next DFU iteration, the input-output buffer doesn't overwrite the previously freed buffer. This precise memory arrangement is critical for the next stage. Finally, there's the control flow hijack. The exploit overwrites a USB device I/O request object to replace legitimate function pointers with addresses pointing to the attacker's payload code. When the device tries to execute what it thinks is normal USB handling code, it's actually running the exploit code. This is what we call a code execution primitive, the holy grail of exploitation.
Whoa, slow down with the jargon, buddy. Heap what?
Sorry. Think of it like carefully arranging furniture in a room. The attacker is precisely arranging objects in memory to set up for the final move, which is hijacking the control flow. They replace legitimate function pointers with their own code.
And that lets them run whatever code they want, even if Apple didn't sign it?
Bingo! And what's wild is that while Apple fixed aspects of this in newer chips, A12 and later, the core vulnerability is still there. They just broke the exploit chain by removing the memory leak that made initial exploitation possible. It's a great example of how even the smallest implementation detail can have massive security implications.
So once Palera1n gets its foot in the door with Checkmate, what happens next?
So there are two ways Palera1n can work: rootless or rootful mode. Rootless is safer but more limited, while rootful gives deeper access but is riskier. The distinction is important because iOS has evolved to have more security partitioning over time. The jailbreak process is pretty fascinating from a technical perspective. First, you have to get your device into DFU mode, which requires a precise sequence and timing of button presses. Power button, plus volume down on newer devices. This can be especially tricky on the iPhone X. Once in DFU mode, Palera1n executes the Checkmate exploit to gain low-level control. It then boots what's called Pongo OS, which is essentially a minimal operating system that runs before iOS itself loads. Pongo OS was developed as part of the Palera1n project and provides a powerful interface for modifying the boot process. It's written in C and runs directly on the device's hardware, giving complete control over the system. From this privileged position, Palera1n loads a series of critical components in sequence. There's a custom kernel patch finder that programmatically identifies security-related code in the iOS kernel. Things like code signing enforcement, sandbox restrictions, and kernel patch protection, KPP, on older devices, or kernel integrity protection, KIPI, on newer ones. Then it loads a specially crafted RAM disk. That's essentially a small file system that exists only in memory. This RAM disk contains all the tools needed to modify the system, including utilities to mount the iOS file system and apply patches. Finally, it installs an overlay file that adds the jailbreak components to the iOS environment. This is where things like Substrate or Substitute come in. Those are the frameworks that allow tweaks to modify system behavior.
Like a middleman that can mess with iOS before it even starts?
Spot on. From there, it loads a bunch of components: a kernel patch finder to modify security code, a RAM disk with jailbreak tools, and an overlay file that adds jailbreak stuff to iOS. Eventually, you get a loader app that lets you install Celio or another package manager.
Sounds pretty smooth. Any catches?
One big one: if you've got an iPhone 8, 8 Plus, or X running iOS 16 or higher, you can't use passcodes, Face ID, or Touch ID while jailbroken. This is because of a fundamental architectural change Apple made starting with iOS 16 on these devices. The issue relates to how the Secure Enclave Processor, SEP, interacts with the rest of the system. The SEP is a separate coprocessor that handles all cryptographic operations, including managing the secure storage of biometric data and encryption keys. In iOS 16, Apple implemented additional verification steps between the SEP and the main system that essentially prevent jailbroken devices from accessing SEP functionality. It's actually a brilliant security move when you think about it. Even if an attacker compromises the main system, the SEP remains secure and won't hand over sensitive cryptographic material. For users, though, it means choosing between jailbreak features and basic security features, which is a tough trade-off.
What? Why not? That seems like a pretty big downside.
It's because of Apple's Secure Enclave processor. They implemented extra security measures that basically make it impossible for these security features to work alongside a jailbreak on those specific devices. It's a calculated trade-off the Palera1n team couldn't avoid due to how the SEP is architected.
Interesting. So what kind of security measures is Palera1n actually bypassing?
Oh, there are layers upon layers here. iOS security is like an onion, and Palera1n has to peel back multiple layers to achieve a working jailbreak. Let me walk through the main ones. First, there's the secure boot chain, or what Apple calls the chain of trust. In normal operation, when an iPhone boots up, each component cryptographically verifies the next component before handing over control. It starts at the boot ROM, then goes to the low-level bootloader, LLB, then iBoot, then the iOS kernel itself. Each link in this chain checks the cryptographic signature of the next to ensure it hasn't been tampered with. Since checkmate hits the very first link in this chain, the boot ROM, it can modify how this verification process works for every subsequent component. It essentially breaks the chain at its root. Second, there's AMFI, Apple Mobile File Integrity. This is a kernel extension that enforces code signing requirements throughout iOS. Any application or library that tries to execute code is checked by AMFI to ensure it has a valid signature from Apple. Palera1n patches AMFI to either disable these checks entirely or to accept alternative signatures. Then there's the sandbox. iOS has an extremely sophisticated application sandbox that restricts what apps can do, what files they can access, what system services they can use, and so on. Palera1n modifies these restrictions to allow jailbreak apps and tweaks to break out of the sandbox and access system resources they normally couldn't. There's also kernel patch protection, which is designed to prevent runtime modification of the kernel. Palera1n uses sophisticated techniques to apply its necessary patches while avoiding detection by these protection mechanisms. And finally, in iOS, the system partition is mounted as read-only, and its integrity is verified. Palera1n's rootless mode actually works around this by making modifications to user partitions rather than touching the system partition itself. This is a clever approach that maintains compatibility with newer iOS versions that have stronger system partition protection.
And I'm guessing the Palera1 team has to update their techniques with each iOS release.
Yep, they analyze each iOS update and adapt. That's why it still works on iOS 18.3.2, even though Checkmate was discovered years ago. The team does an impressive job of keeping up with Apple's changes.
What about technical challenges? There must be a lot of weird edge cases when you're working at this level.
Oh, for sure. Developing and maintaining a jailbreak like Palera1n is a constant battle against edge cases and unexpected behaviors. One of the most complicated aspects is platform compatibility across the range of supported devices. Each chip generation, A8, A9, A10, A11, has subtle differences in how the hardware behaves, especially during the boot process. For example, there's a known issue with A9 and earlier devices where they can get stuck during the Pongo OS boot stage. The Palera1n team had to implement a specific workaround where users can press Ctrl-C to manually continue the process when this happens. This kind of hardware-specific behavior is really difficult to debug because it's happening at such a low level. Then there are the USB connectivity issues. This is where things get really arcane. The USB protocol implementation varies between different cables, USB controllers, and operating systems. Palera1n's documentation specifically recommends using USB-A cables over USB-C because different accessory IDs can affect the USB voltage pin assertion during the exploit phase. On Apple Silicon Macs, there are additional quirks with USB-C ports that sometimes require manually unplugging and replugging the cable after the Checkmate exploit attempts to run. From a CPU perspective, the team discovered that AMD CPUs have a surprisingly low success rate with the Checkmate exploit, with the exception of AMD mobile chips. This is likely due to differences in how their USB controllers handle timing-sensitive operations during the DFU process. As a result, they recommend using either Intel CPUs or Macs for the most reliable jailbreak experience. There's also a whole class of issues around securing the software supply chain. With jailbreak tools being high-value targets for malicious actors, ensuring that users get legitimate versions is crucial. The Palera1n team digitally signs their code and emphasizes that users should only download from official sources to mitigate this risk.
This all sounds like a security researcher's dream. What directions do you think this kind of research will go next?
There are so many fascinating research avenues opening up from what we've learned through Checkmate and Palera1n. One of the most promising areas is in hardware security analysis. The Checkmate vulnerability showed that even Apple's meticulously designed hardware can have fundamental flaws. Researchers are now applying similar methodologies to examine newer chips like the A12 through A17 Bionic. They're looking not just at the USB stack, but at other potential attack surfaces in the boot ROM. There's also significant research into how Apple has enhanced its secure boot process in response to Checkmate. The A12 and newer chips have improved boot ROM security, and understanding exactly what changes were made helps researchers develop better security models for future systems. They're particularly interested in how Apple managed to close the specific vulnerability while maintaining all the necessary functionality. The SEP independence issue I mentioned earlier is another hot research area. Apple is clearly moving toward a model where critical security components operate more independently from the main system. Researchers are examining the boundaries between these security domains to understand if there are potential vulnerabilities in how they communicate. Then there's the persistence challenge. Current checkmate-based jailbreaks are semi-tethered, requiring a computer connection to re-establish the jailbreak after a restart. Researchers are exploring potential persistence mechanisms that could maintain security while providing better user experience. This is particularly challenging because any persistence mechanism, by definition, needs to survive a reboot, which means finding ways to store state that can be safely recovered. Perhaps most interesting is the escalating research into the secure enclave processor itself. As Apple continues to offload more security-critical operations to the SEP, understanding this component becomes increasingly important. The SEP runs its own operating system called CPOS, which is a completely separate environment with its own security model. The limitations that Palera1n faces with SEP functionality on newer iOS versions indicate this is a critical area for security researchers to explore.
And I'm guessing people want a fully untethered jailbreak, so you don't need a computer when your phone restarts.
That's definitely a goal. Right now, checkmate-based jailbreaks are semi-tethered, meaning you need a computer to re-jailbreak after restart. Finding secure persistence mechanisms would be huge. A true untethered jailbreak would need to find a way to persist the exploit in a way that survives the entire boot process. That's extremely challenging with modern iOS devices because of all the integrity checking that happens during boot. You'd essentially need a chain of exploits. The boot ROM exploit followed by some kind of persistence exploit that survives into the fully booted system. The last major untethered jailbreak we saw was back around iOS 9, and the bar has gotten much higher since then. But if there's one thing the jailbreak community has shown, it's persistence and creativity. So I wouldn't count them out.
So to wrap this all up, Palera1n is a jailbreak that uses an unpatchable hardware vulnerability from 2019 that works on iPhone 6s through 10 on basically any iOS version, though newer chips are safe, and it shows that even Apple's super secure iOS can have fundamental flaws that can't be fixed with software updates.
Exactly. It's a fascinating window into iOS security for researchers. And for users with those older devices, it means permanent jailbreak capabilities regardless of iOS updates. The implications for security research are profound. It gives us insights into how even the most carefully engineered systems can have vulnerabilities at their lowest levels. And for Apple, it's been a valuable lesson too. The boot ROM in newer chips has been significantly hardened against similar attacks. This is how security evolves. Vulnerabilities are found, exploited, and then fixed in future generations. It's a constant cycle of improvement driven by this kind of research.
This has been a blast. Thanks for breaking it all down, Alex.
Always a pleasure, Jamie. And thanks everyone for tuning in to UBG Bytes.